Project Committee, and we welcome you today on World AIDS Day. Let me acknowledge first off that we are so grateful to those of you who advocate for people living with HIV or AIDS, and we so respect those who are living with HIV because we understand and appreciate the difficulties you live with, not only with health concerns, but also the impacts on legal issues and social issues. So today, we are delighted to present a roundtable discussion of current and emerging legal and policy issues. So we are happy to have with us several experts. And let me first introduce Schoettes, who is openly living with HIV and is Counsel and HIV Project Director at Lambda Legal. Scott litigates impact cases involving discriminatory actions based on a person's HIV status and authors numerous amicus briefs on issues of import to people living with HIV. You may recall Scott recently litigated on behalf of Air Force service members and successfully prevented their discharge based on their status. Scott's policy portfolio includes HIV criminalization and the blood donation ban. And he served on the Presidential Advisory Council on HIV/AIDS from 2014 to 2017. Courtney Cross is an assistant professor of clinical legal instruction and the director of the Domestic Violence Law Clinic. Prior to joining the faculty at the University of Alabama School of Law, Professor Cross taught in the litigation clinic at the University of Denver and was a clinical teaching fellow in the domestic violence clinic at Georgetown University, where she earned her LLM. Before she began teaching, Professor Cross was an Equal Justice Works AmeriCorps Fellow and staff attorney at a women's reentry nonprofit in Washington, DC. Professor Cross received her JD from New York University and her BA magna cum laude from UC San Diego. Her research focuses on the myriad intersections between domestic violence, HIV, and health, poverty, and criminal law. Brad Sears is Interim Executive Director and David Sanders Distinguished Scholar of Law and Policy at the Williams Institute and is Associate Dean of Public Interest Law at UCLA Law School. Brad is the founding executive director of the Williams Institute, which he led from 2001 to 2017. Brad has published a number of research studies, primarily on discrimination against LGBT people and people living with HIV. He has taught courses on LGBT and disability law at UCLA, Harvard, and Whittier Law Schools. He has testified before Congress and state legislators, authored numerous amicus briefs in key court cases, and helped to draft state and federal legislation. He's cited frequently by national media. So welcome to all of our guests, our panelists, and those who are listening and watching. I would like to begin this conversation by asking each panel member to take a few minutes to talk with us about policy issues that they see as critical at this point in time. So Scott, why don't we begin with you?
Thank you, Margaret. Thank you. Well, I mean, I think there's such a wide range of things as we shift from one administration to another that are really important for us to be thinking about and addressing, and in many respects of hopefully getting back on track. You know, I think we'll talk about these things in more detail, but I see the Affordable Care Act and the future of the Affordable Care Act as a critical issue for how we're going to actually get a handle on the epidemic and meet our goals of ending the epidemic within 10 years. There's the case before the Supreme Court right now. We'll sure be talking more about that. We've also got some work to do around racial justice and gender justice that I think are critical also to addressing the HIV/AIDS epidemic. And then, of course, the ongoing discrimination, both in places like the military, with outdated policies regarding people living with HIV, as well as the criminalization issues, which is another manifestation of discrimination that borders into violence, really, in terms of human rights and a person's life. So those are sort of the broad topic issues that I would identify as critical.
Thank you, Scott. Brad?
Yeah, thank you. And it's great to be here today. I would agree with all of that. I think if I was among the many issues facing us in 2020 and 2021, to pinpoint a few, I would say housing is kind of at the top of the list. Here in Los Angeles County alone, we're expecting the number of evictions to be in the hundreds of thousands in early 2021 if our rent moratorium gets lifted. And so we know that housing is critical for people with HIV and for anyone who's vulnerable and trying to take care of a healthcare situation. And so the impact on people living with HIV from this coming eviction cliff or tsunami, we have various names for it here and across the country, is going to be huge. And our legal services organizations and the legal services infrastructure is going to have to be strong and kind of expanded to meet that need. I guess I would echo Scott's comment about focusing on racial inequality. There's a reason why a map of new COVID infections in this country that kind of goes from the Midwest to the South looks like a map of new HIV infections in this country. It goes from the Midwest down to the South. That looks like a map of the density of slaves in the first time that the US ever plotted people on a map using census data in 1860 that looked like density around the Mississippi River going down from the upper Midwest to the South and then across to the Eastern Seaboard. And if I mapped a lack of education, any sort of health problem, mental health problems, lack of health insurance, those maps all look the same and they all map on to race. And so I think COVID-19, like HIV, is just another reminder that the epidemics, they don't begin with the first infection. They don't end with the next cure. Like unless we address these underlying kind of disparities in race, poverty, we're not going to, we're just, we have the grooves already in the ground set for the next epidemic. So to really kind of conquer this epidemic and prevent future ones, we have to address those disparities. And finally, I think this is moment, and we can come back to this later. It's just a great moment to remind ourselves that basic kind of sex education and public health education, I guess, more broadly, is extremely important. And hopefully we can talk about this later, but that this new administration can think from, elementary school up to adults about how to re-educate and keep educating Americans about public health and sexual health.
Thank you, Brad. And Courtney?
Thank you. So I totally agree, of course, with everything that Brad and Scott have been saying, and it's such an honor to be on this panel with them. I know that they're doing unbelievably incredible work, specifically targeting folks living with HIV. The work that I do is a little bit different. I work with survivors of violence in family law cases, which you might think would put me separate and apart from the HIV advocacy world, but practicing here in Alabama and practicing in Washington, D.C. particularly, we saw such a nexus between those two worlds. We saw so much overlap in terms of folks living with HIV being specifically targeted by abusive partners because of their status. And we see so much retaliation when serostatus is disclosed. And on the other hand, we see survivors of violence, especially here in the South, like we had mentioned, running afoul of state HIV exposure criminalization laws for failing to disclose their status out of a fear of retaliation, physical violence, and abuse. And so one place that I see a lot of work to be done at both the state and federal level is going to be reevaluating these criminal exposure laws. And much like Brad was talking about, thinking about a pivot away from using criminal law as a way to attempt to mitigate HIV transmission and spread, and thinking instead about public health policies that we could use. And my scholarship focuses a lot on harm reduction. So things like sex education in public schools, things like needle exchange, things like safe, inexpensive access to PrEP and PEP. So I think that in addition to what we've been talking about, really thinking about ways that communities, states, and even the federal government would be able to support a pivot towards public health and harm reduction measures is going to be really important as we're entering into the next administration.
Thank you all. And for our participants, I noticed the questions have already started in the Q&A format, and we would like you to put your questions in the Q&A rather than the chat. And so what we will do now is just turn this over to our experts to talk about various issues and policy issues that they see as creating much harm now and maybe some possible remedies to this. And we know that criminalization laws are among the most serious that impact those living with HIV or AIDS. And I'd like to start the conversation there and just have each of you in conversation, just pop in whenever to talk with us about the criminalization laws and the particular impacts that you're seeing. So I'll go ahead, Brad. Go ahead.
I'll go ahead and jump in. And I'd say I'm also a person living with HIV, and it's interesting for very random reasons. A journal sitting next to me that I was writing in the fall of 1995, which is when I found out I was HIV positive. I was diagnosed with AIDS a few months later, and I was reading this recently because I wrote an entry on the day before I went to the doctor and found out that the new medications that became available in 1996 were going to work for me. And then I wrote one the day after. And it was quite a long entry the day before about kind of the status of my life and where I thought, how much life I actually had. I thought I left because that time a doctor had said I had 6 to 18 months to live. And I just want to acknowledge it's World AIDS Day. We've come so incredibly far from that moment. And when we think about HIV criminalization, I think we have to think about a relic of the ignorance and the fear of that moment that has been allowed to exist into the present day and that really still impacts people today. So I thought I'd start out maybe just talking a little bit about some of the research that we've been doing in various states that still have these laws, which is the majority of states, both in terms of kind of what we know about when they were enacted, which I think in recent research we've done in Nevada is really spelled out nicely, and then what we know today about who these laws continue to still impact, as Courtney was referencing. And I think most of you, if you're on this, if you're listening to this webinar, know what HIV criminal laws are, but they're laws passed mainly in the mid to late 80s, early 90s, and then amended a bunch since, that criminalize certain behaviors of people with HIV. Some you might, think are more rational, like sex or needle sharing. Then they go to kind of blood and organ donation, biting, scratching, solicitation, whether or not anyone's having sex or not when they're arrested for solicitation, and kind of catch-all phrases and terminology that sweep in pretty much anything, particularly if it's vis-a-vis an employee of the state, like a corrections officer, law enforcement officer, public health or mental health person who works for the state. So it's kind of the broad sweep of the laws. And so we've been doing some research, both looking back, kind of recovering this kind of legislative history. Some of us were around for, and we're still here now, and looking at who they impact today. And so I think Nevada, the legislative history of the Nevada bill is probably the state that most directly spells out why these laws were passed. So in the early 1990s, Nevada is considering in a legislative session repealing its sodomy laws. So this is a good thing for LGBT rights, decriminalizing same-sex sex. Who shows up to oppose that but the cast of characters around at the time, working for like the Family Research Council, these kind of pseudo research center type organizations, presenting kind of pamphlets and brochures saying that gay men want to spread disease, they're serial killers, they molest children, and just you have all these kind of conservative people, some of who are well known, like Paul Cameron, who's a kind of a research or quasi research center, thrown out of his professional societies, thrown out of courts as not being an expert witness, showing up at these legislative hearings saying you have to have sodomy laws. He doesn't win by blocking the sodomy laws, but what the head of the Senate Judiciary Committee in Nevada says is, we're not going to repeal the state sodomy law without criminalizing HIV, that we have to do that. We're either going to do it as an amendment to the repeal of the sodomy law or a separate bill. And lo and behold, in the exact same session, they pass this bill. You also have people testifying, about bisexual men who are spreading the disease. Everyone dies if they get if they get HIV. Just kind of all of this information, a lot of it not true at the time, to the extent that some of it was more accurate, definitely not true today. But this is the context that these laws are passed in. So I think sometimes, even when we work against these laws, we tend to give credit to the legislatures that pass them a little bit more than we should about the motivations. Clearly, in this legislative history, kind of homophobia and AIDS phobia are the dominant chords in the passing of the legislation. So they get started in the 1980s and 90s. They still exist today. So the other kind of line of research we've done at the Williams Institute is looking at exactly who do these laws impact. And I'll just go through some of the major findings, and then maybe Scott and Courtney want to jump in. I think one of the main things is we've now done these studies in California, Missouri, Florida, and Georgia. And in every state, if you looked at media reports or court cases kind of documenting enforcement beforehand, you might find 1 to 2 dozen examples of enforcement. I live in California. If you'd asked me before we did the study in 2015, how many people had been directly impacted by the law in California, I probably would have said about 20, and maybe no one got convicted, because sometimes you'd read a newspaper article about people getting charged, but you wouldn't necessarily see that they'd ever been, kind of fully prosecuted and convicted. Turns out that's not true. In each of the states we've looked at, the numbers are not in the dozens, they're in the hundreds. In California, it was 800 people who had an arrest for one of the HIV crimes. And we've seen similar patterns in each state. So in those 4 states alone, about 2,000 people have been arrested for an HIV crime in those 4 states. The second thing that we find, which kind of proves up a point that we've been making, is that kind of 95% of these people plus who are arrested have been arrested under a statute where there's no requirement that anyone gets infected. There's no requirement that there's any intent to infect someone. And I think this is the most surprising, the statute is broad enough that we don't even know if the conduct could infect someone. Let me go to kind of California, where I mentioned there are about 800 arrests. 95% of those are a penalty enhancement for solicitation. And so how do you get arrested for solicitation? You're either observed, usually outside or on the street, or you're actually entrapped by a law enforcement officer. You're arrested for that conversation. You can be arrested in many states for having condoms on you. So it's no sex is usually visibly seen. You don't know if the person is going to have a type of sex that is more risk, that creates more risk for transmitting HIV. You don't know if the person, it doesn't matter if the person is undetectable or not. So when I'm saying most of the arrests, 90% plus, are pursuant to statutes that don't even require conduct that can transmit the virus, that's what I'm talking about. And so these laws are not following kind of general principles of criminal law. There's no culpable conduct, intent, and there's no harm. That's kind of the other major finding. We kind of already knew that, but able to show in the numbers that this is most people impacted this law, the vast majority of people impacted by these laws. And in terms of behavior, it gets worse. In a state like Missouri, which has specific crimes for exposing employees of the Department of Corrections, which includes police in Missouri, and the Department of Mental Health, which includes people who work in mental health facilities. You can be arrested for an HIV crime for attempted spitting by the letter of the statute. So you don't even have to spit and hit. Yeah, you attempt to spit, that's an HIV crime according to the terms of the statute. So these can be kind of very attenuated in terms of anything that could transmit the virus. The third major finding I kind of already mentioned is I think when these laws were passed, the media image out there was of, kind of a predatory male, maybe a bisexual male, maybe somebody like Newshawn Williams. That's who was the kind of used to strike fear in people to pass these laws. Disproportionately, women are impacted by these laws. And as I mentioned, sex workers. And so in California, we have the most extreme example, but that pattern holds true in Georgia and Florida, less so when we looked at Missouri. But I think a disproportionate number of straight people, of straight women or cisgender women and trans women are being picked up through these sex work enhancements. The kind of next major trend is based on race. And I think, I said less so for sex work in Missouri, more so for race. So in Missouri, Black men make up 3.5% of the general population. They make up 35% of people living with HIV. They make up 54% of people arrested for an HIV crime, and they make up 60% of those convicted. And so, I like to sum this up as if you have an epidemic or a disease that disproportionately impacts Black people, and you have criminal justice system that disproportionately impacts Black people, and then you make a crime out of that disease, you're just going to get one impact, which I think Missouri illustrates very well. And I want to pause for a second and just to show you how HIV functions as a proxy for race or Blackness in enforcement. Talk about a trend that we saw around St. Louis, Missouri, and the surrounding counties, which is this: I was about to say someone, but to be more specific, Black men, because it was true in all of these cases, were charged with resisting arrest. That was part of their charge at arrest, resisting arrest. Prosecutors then find out the defendant's HIV positive and switch this to this very old 1980s, early 1990s HIV crime because they know the person's HIV positive, and there's a catch-all provision at the end of that statute that basically includes anything that might transmit HIV. So they've taken a charge of with a sentence of a couple of years tripled it to sentences of 9, 10 years plus. And then what happens in our criminal justice system? People plead. Over 90% of people, criminal defendants, plea. And so case after case, I think it's about 30% of the HIV convictions in the St. Louis area are this fact pattern. Somebody being charged with resisting arrest, that being flipped to the old HIV crime, and then the people pleading, the Black men, again, to be more specific, pleading to this higher sentence. So I think it confirms something that we've heard prosecutors say. They like these crimes because they're easy to prove and they have high sentences and they can get people to plead to other things. And I think that's a dramatic example of that. And then I'll just wrap up with the final trend. I just focused in on St. Louis. In each of the 4 states that we looked at, you can focus in on 1 to 3 counties who are doing most of the enforcement. So the St. Louis area is responsible for about 60% of all the HIV arrests in the state of Missouri, although only about 35% of people living with HIV in Missouri live in that same St. Louis area. You go to the other side of the state, if you're familiar with Missouri, which is Kansas City, the exact opposite. They have about half the number of HIV arrests in relation to the proportion of people living with HIV in that area. So the practices of local law enforcement and prosecutors makes a big difference. And I think, and we've seen that in each state. So this opens up a local strategy in addition to a state level strategy in really trying to kind of combat these laws. So I'm going to stop there. I've been talking for a while to let other people jump in.
I'd like to ask you a question, if I could, Brad, based on what you said. So I thought it was really interesting, the information you've gathered about Nevada. I understand it's only one state, so you're not saying that this is the way it happened across the country. But I always assumed, and it was kind of there in the comment you made about testimony about bisexual men. I always kind of assumed that the legislators didn't care so much if this was happening within the gay community, and that where the real concern was if they were going to contaminate the heterosexual community. So maybe you could talk a little bit about the extent to which you think that was really at play as a primary motivator, rather than, oh, we really care about these gay men who are getting infected. And then the other question sort of wrapped in there, I know in some other places the laws came into effect after 1996, when people were living with HIV as opposed to dying with HIV. And if you have any comments or thoughts about that, and whether you've seen that in any of the research that you've done.
Yeah, I mean, I think those are great points, and I do think it is. I do think it's this fear about HIV spreading from, it's identified as a gay disease and it's spreading into the straight community that is driving a lot of this. I think the enhancements for sex work, that's exactly also what it is there's this kind of bad, these bad actors out there, and we don't want that to spread into the rest of society. So you could imagine, for example, prosecutions of people of the Johns, of people who are seeking sex work, as opposed to the sex workers who might be putting the sex workers more at risk. You're not seeing that. It's the entire focus is on the enhancement for somebody engaged in sex work. And there's some interesting kind of news stories in Nevada, kind of a few years after it's passed, talking about the number of prosecutions against sex workers. And then the kind of real fear is some man's wife becomes infected because the man has slept with the sex worker. Again, when the sex worker probably is the person, most at risk from an HIV positive John. And I just, and this image of the bi as the dangerous kind of person out there, I think was very much in the media, at that time. I'm sorry, what was the second question you asked, Scott?
The second question was about sort of the second wave of HIV criminalization laws, occurring really after people were living with HIV. And my theory is that that was motivated by this concern around, well, at one point, maybe people living with HIV were looked at as victims, and as victims who didn't have long to live, and you didn't have to worry so much about like them being sexually active. And then these laws came into place in some places because, oh, actually, these people are not easily identified anymore. They're not dying with HIV. They're actually living with HIV.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's interesting. I think what's interesting is, so I started out with kind of the story about like, we didn't know much in the beginning and there was a lot of fear. And so you would expect that amendments to these statutes, our new statutes, would get better over time. They would track the science and medicine. They go in the exact opposite. So, because I recently did Missouri, I think it's a good example of that, where it's a sex and needle sharing statute primarily in the beginning. And the spitting, biting, attempting to cause any corrections officer to come into contact with any bodily fluid, those are passed in 2002, 2005, and 2010. So we have a lot of information about how HIV is transmitted. And I think it just further proves that it's not science, not medicine, it's not public health that's motivating these laws. It is kind of more fear mongering, and I think Missouri, this kind of increasing concentration or increasing focus on people who are incarcerated and protecting law enforcement and corrections officers, and I think, as you point out, they're probably dealing with an increasing number of people with HIV who are incarcerated as well, and so they are not responding rationally to that. But I think that's an interesting theory. I mean, one thing, and I think this kind of ties into, so there are these efforts at the state level that kind of Scott, Courtney, we're all involved with. We now, with the new supportive administration, what are some things we can hope for? One kind of origin point for these laws is a provision in some federal funding related to HIV that suggested that states had to have some sort of criminal law with intent, I give you to read that closely, focused on criminalizing the HIV. I think the federal government, just like it created some incentives that led to these laws, can create incentives to get rid of the laws as well. So I think through funding that could happen, if we get in control of the Congress through passage of the Repeal Act, the type of research that I'm doing and are others doing, if the federal government can take on some type of this work and be kind of in the forefront of it, or at least fund it, that would be helpful. That would be helpful to do. So I think there are mechanisms at the federal level. If we have a new HIV strategy and it has even more focus, and DOJ is given a charge to kind of go after some of these laws. I think a clear expression that all parts of the criminal justice system, our programs, our services are covered by the ADA would be helpful. So there are some really helpful things to set up, some of the litigation that's going on as well as legislative efforts.
I think to Scott's question about sort of the second wave of criminalization, going back to something that Brad had said about Newshall Williams, that case was in 1997. And so I think that what we are seeing with the first wave of criminalization was hugely informed by sort of this gay panic, bi panic. And then the second wave of criminalization is very sort of racialized and racially motivated, as now we are not thinking as much about sort of the gay community and sort of seepage and contamination and all of the horrible language being used, thinking about sort of how HIV and AIDS would get into sort of the straight community. But now we're seeing these flashy and salacious examples of Black men who are infecting dozens of white women allegedly, and states are sort of responding then more towards this panic over a promiscuous and possibly sort of closeted or DL Black or African American person who then may be spreading HIV to men, to women alike. You know, in the 90s, there was so much sort of on Maury and Oprah talking about sort of folks on the DL and the way that would be spread from the gay community to women, that what we're seeing is just sort of rotating stigma in terms of what is leading the charge behind waves of criminalization. And while we're talking about stigma, I think what Brad was talking about in terms of sort of sex workers being particularly sought out under these crimes is absolutely right. And it is interesting to note that in a couple states, and I pulled them while he was talking, Florida, Kentucky, South Carolina, Tennessee, even if the sex worker's client is aware of the sex worker status, that disclosure still isn't even a defense to the crime, which can be then added on top of sort of the solicitation in its own right. So we are seeing such a deliberate attack on folks who are engaged in survival sex work and sex work generally, and that this is another angle that is being used to sort of further that stigma and further ensnare those folks in the criminal legal system as well. And then the last point that Brad has raised that I think is interesting to think about, you know, he was talking about how different counties will account for such large numbers of arrests and prosecutions in a state. I think it's also interesting to think regionally. You know, the HIV Center for Law and Policy did a study, and I think they found 395 arrests and prosecutions between 2009 and 2019. We think that there are a fair amount more than that, but the research can be challenging. But of those 395, over half took place in the South. And within the South, there were 4 states that ended up accounting for nearly half of the arrests in the South. And I'm going to find it for you because I think it's worth flagging. I had pulled it in my notes. So of that 395, 207 took place across the South, and Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, and Tennessee alone accounted for a third of that number. And so we are seeing such a boom in the use of these statutes that are so antiquated and that have diverged so far from the science that we might think that they are obsolete. And in certain communities, they may very well be. But when we look at either marginalized communities or sort of vulnerable communities in typically underfunded regions, we are seeing that they are still being used very actively.
Scott, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I was just going to, well, I think everything that Courtney just said is absolutely right, and actually brings to mind for me the case that we've been working on recently on behalf of Nico Brito-Ramos, who was, now the case that we were working on for him involved actually him being denied a haircut in a Los Angeles barber shop. But the reason that the barber in Los Angeles knew of his HIV status was that that person had been a barber in Chicago, and Nico had been the first man prosecuted under South Dakota's HIV criminalization law in the early 2000s. And it's everything that Courtney was just talking about in terms of a very sensationalized, racialized prosecution of this young Black man in a community of mostly white people. And so all these things come together, and then of course they reverberate, you know, way past that that incident. I mean, he spent time in prison, so obviously it had a tremendous effect on his life. But then it also doesn't seem to ever go away for him because of the way in which this was sensationalized and whatnot. I wanted to comment on what Brad said about the federal government and what the federal government can do. And, you know, we've looked in the past at conditioning, further, putting it into something like Ryan White to incentivize. But of course, the concern there is, would you, or I should say, legislators are reluctant to put any strings on HIV funding to states that already aren't doing, necessarily doing the best job of providing their people with health care and HIV care. So I wonder if you have any thoughts about that, Brad, and those concerns about doing it in that particular way.
Yeah, I mean, obviously that would be a concern. I guess I've seen states move pretty rapidly in response to any threat to their funding around HIV in the past. So I mean, particularly around kind of the swiftness, we moved to names reporting, which the funding connection was a little more direct there. But even I think the passage of a spate of these laws. So hopefully they would react, and I think it would make sense to give them some time to react and not make it an absolute trigger. I wanted to follow up on something else, because it's another part of the research that I think helps like kind of blow up this kind of image of who's being impacted by these laws is age. And I always talk, it's so easy to talk about, gender and race, but like we also do the age breakdown of when people are arrested from these crimes. And in California, the youngest age was 14. There was about 20 to 30% that were arrested after the age of 24. And the oldest age, I think, was 73. So you're talking about 14 to 73-year-olds being arrested for these crimes. I don't think that's who we're thinking about. And if you look at the people who are at each end of those ranges, they're women. So these are people who could be being trafficked, having survival sex, and doing sex work in California, being picked up. If you're 14 in California and you have enhancement for HIV, that means that's your second arrest for solicitation. So we're taking a misdemeanor on somebody of that age and turning to a felony and adding 3 years of a sentence. And another thing that we've looked at is the HIV crime the first crime or the only crime that someone has ever committed? And it's true that about 20% it's the only crime. So it's their only interaction with the criminal justice system. For almost a quarter, it is their first interaction with the criminal justice system. And we know once you're kind of in the system, you're more likely to remain in the system. So we're bringing people into the criminal justice system and incarcerating them who would not be there but for these crimes. One thing we did for Missouri, which we're now going to do for all of the states, is also just do the cost impact. And we were only able to do this for incarceration in Missouri, but we figured because of its HIV crimes, the state spent about $17 to $18 million keeping people incarcerated because of these HIV crimes. It's just another way to show kind of the magnitude of what's going on. And something that we also know is kind of just contrary to reaching any sort of public health goal.
And the collateral consequences are so sprawling, not just for the convictions, which of course we know can impact employment and access to housing and access to public benefits, but even the arrest itself can usher in sort of a host of formal and informal collateral consequences. If you're detained long enough, you may lose your job. But we've heard stories of folks that it is the arrest that then sort of outed them for both having HIV and perhaps their sexuality. So even if someone is arrested and the DA uses the discretion that Brad was talking about and doesn't end up charging, the arrest itself can have such wide-ranging consequences on people's lives that we really need to think more about getting the laws off of the books than convincing the DAs to make sound charging decisions, because at that point, the choices that have been set in motion can still prove so damaging for the people who've been arrested. And My scholarship looks at examples where abusive partners are going to the police and saying, hey, I just found out that my girlfriend, boyfriend is HIV positive and they never told me. And so ushering in that arrest when in many cases they did tell them. In some cases, it was the abusive partner themselves who they became HIV positive from sexual interactions with, but abusive individuals are using these laws to further levy the power of the state against the folks that they're abusing. And it just creates such a massive web of collateral consequences, and probably Avalanche is better suited than Web in terms of from the minute this process starts, folks are losing their liberty, they are seeing job prospects decrease, they are seeing private information become public, and it is problematic from the get-go.
Yeah, and from there, I thought it'd be good to talk a little bit about what we are doing to try and get these laws off the books, or maybe some of the frustrations I think that we're having now around reforming these laws. And so you sort of touched on slightly, there is this ongoing debate about do we reform the laws and make them impossible to prosecute, which has been sort of the strategy that has been used in most places in order to, and the main concern there is that when you take the laws, the HIV specific laws off the books, prosecutions still happen, right? And we know that the HIV specific laws are only one part of the problem. And we see in places like Texas, which repealed its HIV specific law, that the prosecutors use other general criminal laws, aggravated assault, sexual assault, even things like attempted murder to prosecute people. So, and actually we're engaged in Illinois right now. And I see it as sort of an experiment we're going to be moving an effort to actually repeal Illinois' HIV criminalization law, which was, a decision that we came to based on doing a lot of, sort of community engagement and trying to, figure out what it was that people wanted. And so I think it's a good thing that there's some place doing that. And I'm also at the same time a little concerned as the attorney in Illinois, who will end up with those calls if the laws are used, the general criminal laws are used, and in some ways can be harder to defend against if they don't have sort of those built-in guardrails. The other thing that I'll just, I feel like we've been successful in a few states, but I will say that the pace of change for me is frustratingly slow in terms of getting these laws changed. And to the point that the two of you were making, we've been successful mostly in states across the north and the northern part of the country. And really there hasn't been the same kind of change in states where we know these laws and prosecutions can be most problematic. And I'm not sure, I have some ideas and thoughts about what's slowing us down, but it's tough in some of the places. I've been very involved in Florida, where for years now we have attempted to move a bill, and we really haven't gotten anywhere. Now it feels like each year we get a little bit closer maybe, but these things are particularly difficult to move. And I would say particularly difficult when if you're trying to move everything all at once and attacking sex work, the sex work provisions. And I wonder how much, I think that our movement should also have a commitment to simply legalizing sex work, but that's going to take longer and like changing hearts and minds about that. And I worry, I will say, about the people that are getting incarcerated in places like Florida, in places like Georgia, and all across the South, while we wait for maybe the perfect solution to HIV criminalization. So, do you have any thoughts about any of that?
Well, we have a question that I'd like to pose to all of you.
Yeah.
And this question concerns a person with HIV who's used a condom, but at the time doesn't realize they have HIV, but later discover this. Is there any way that person could be criminally liable?
Most of the laws, as I have understood them, the person needs to have knowledge of their status in order to be liable under them, though it can still sort of trigger a cascade of consequences if they're in a state where partner notification is being handled by the health department. It may still be the case that person becomes aware of that knowledge, but it shouldn't be the case, at least under the exposure specific laws, that they would be liable under them, because it does require that person knows that they're HIV positive. Although I'm sure that Brad would be aware if there are sort of exceptions to that general rule.
Well, I was going to pitch it to Scott, but I Scott may know this better, but I'll take a stab. I think in most states, if you don't disclose, you can run afoul of the HIV criminal law. That like disclosure is really the key. I'm almost certain that's true for Missouri, Georgia, and Florida. It's having sex without disclosing. Definitely the crime. In California, if you use a condom or disclose, you of the felony here. I don't know, Scott. Do you know more precisely? I think most states using a condom doesn't actually get you out of the crime.
Yeah, so there's kind of two issues they're wrapped up here, and I think you've each addressed them correctly. So first, I'll just preface this by saying I'm not giving legal advice. So if this person is like asking for themselves, I just want to make sure that's not what I'm doing here. So I think both those answers are correct, which is, well, if you don't know, then you aren't usually held to a disclosure standard. But then, as Brad was saying, often it doesn't matter whether you used a condom or not. You still have to disclose once you know. However, I will say there is at least one state, and I think maybe I've seen bills in other states that we've knocked down that have tried to move to a know or should have known standard. So, actually trying to get at people who maybe didn't get tested and address what we use as an argument in favor of getting rid of these laws, which is that you are discouraging testing. And so these types of laws, or this law, whichever state it is, and I can't remember right off the top of my head, but it's designed to say, oh no, if you kind of had an inkling and then chose not to test to avoid that knowledge, you could be still held to that under that law, sadly.
Okay, what I'd like to do now is move on to our other questions that have been posed, some of which do not directly address criminalization, but other concerns that impact the status of people living with HIV and their vulnerability. So one question is, where do you see people of color and veterans or veterans who are long-term survivors fitting in when you're addressing policy concerns?
So I'm not exactly sure what the question is getting at. I will say that I mean, I think people of color have to be at the center of our advocacy that we're doing around HIV. And, for all the reasons that we've been discussing, and and some that we haven't been, just about the disproportionate impact of HIV on communities of color, that if we're not addressing the needs of the communities most impacted, and that would include then transgender people, in addition to gay men, and of course the people at the intersections of those things, those identities. If we're not addressing those things, then we're not really addressing the epidemic or going to get at the heart of it. This is actually one of the things that I wanted to mention on today's call is, I think that one of the, and Brad kind of referred to this obliquely, one of the things that we've seen over the past 4 years is a real focus on just the biomedical side of HIV prevention. That, well, if you get everybody tested, and then get everybody on medication who tests positive, and get everybody on PrEP who tests negative but is at risk, we've solved the epidemic. And we know that not to be the case. And we know that we need to address all the social determinants of health if we are going to actually get a handle on the HIV epidemic. I think, there were attempts at the federal level at doing this, certainly under the Obama administration. I think those attempts also continued under the radar, and both at HHS and then within the states. But it'll be great to have them back recentered as a focus of the federal government, and that understanding that if we don't address all racism and transphobia and poverty and homelessness and all of these things, that you're not really going to get at the heart of the problem. Not to say that you won't make some progress, because I think our biomedical tools are amazing and maybe have the most bang for the buck. But if you don't address those other things, you're never going to get to that core group of folks, the folks who are undiagnosed right now, right? Those are the hardest folks to reach, and we have to be addressing the whole person, and that includes addressing things like racism and transphobia, et cetera.
Thank you. We have another question. Is any of you familiar with surveillance laws, surveilling people with HIV and other secret monitoring of people who live with HIV?
I mean, I have some familiarity, but Brad, please jump in.
Yeah, and I have a big picture familiarity as well. But I'll say this: there's surveillance has a specific meaning in public health, which can mean just kind of tracking the course of a disease, and I think COVID-19 is another kind of a good lesson in all these different public health measures. And so when we get those numbers every day, and when you see maps of where people are infected, surveillance helps us do that. That's what allows that, is the collecting information about people who have COVID, who are hospitalized or who have died. Provides that information, allows for the direction of resources. So there are some beneficial aspects to surveillance, and I don't think most of the world could have responded so rapidly to COVID-19 without surveillance. We had the surveillance here and didn't respond very rapidly. But it's a key public health tool, and it comes with risks to people's privacy. And I think HIV reminds us that what is important about privacy is not only your own autonomy about your own healthcare and how you access it in your life, but it's the key protection from discrimination. And I think the case Scott was talking about was really interesting, where an HIV enforcement of a criminal statute reveals someone's status. And so when the state intervenes in this way that spreads people's information about a stigmatized disease, that can have a bunch of impacts that undermine public health. And so you know, I don't know of any secret surveillance strategies out there around HIV. I do know that the technologies available today are so much more sophisticated in tracking HIV and even the spread of HIV, that this is a time to kind of recommit to some of those fundamental kind of balancing of different values around public health and around patient or individual, like me, person with HIV, autonomy and privacy, which ultimately then advance public health efforts, because people with HIV, people with COVID, they need to know that they can trust the public health system so they can get tested, they can access treatment and not face discrimination.
And I would also just quickly add that, to Brad's point, that partner notification and public health surveillance has implications for privacy. It can also have implications for safety. Different states sort of address domestic violence exceptions to partner notification differently. But even if notification is done anonymously, for a lot of my clients, it isn't difficult to make the leap as to who the exposure may have been from. And so as we think about privacy implications, I would urge us to also be thinking about safety implications and ways that we may be able to structure both the policies and their implementation to be thinking about survivors or folks experiencing domestic violence who are also living with HIV.
Absolutely. I've always been concerned about partner notification, about how easy, even in an anonymous situation, it could be to connect those dots. I think for a lot of people. I want to agree with Brad that I think, you know, some of the language is unfortunate because, you know, there's other public health language like intervention that, you know, I think people recoil from a little bit, and surveillance is one of those words. It sounds like, you know, there's someone in a police cruiser outside your home. And so recognizing that that's part of the problem, but there is also, you know, as we're talking about, a real concern about how this information is used. And I don't know if this person is referring specifically to micro surveillance, but I do know within the community of people living with HIV, and certainly among advocates, there is a real concern about how our data has been sort of collected and used in some very, you know, specific biomedical information in a way that doesn't feel transparent, and therefore only exacerbates the distrust that people have. Do I think that, you know, the database that they, you know, where they've collected all of this information in order to engage in microsurveillance is going to be accessed and, you know, used in criminal prosecutions? No, I certainly hope not. But the damage is done in the further, you know, distrust that is created. You know, I will say, I also think sometimes our public health, our friends in public health, and they are our friends, and they have the same goals, right, of reducing disease. But sometimes they miss the forest for the trees. I've often heard people say with respect to microsurveillance, well, it doesn't show directionality, so therefore it couldn't be used in a criminal prosecution to convict someone of their, you know, HIV transmission or exposure. Well, that's only partly true. Yes, that piece of information alone could not be used, but that's not how criminal prosecution works. It's placed into a context of a bunch of other information, and so that could be the piece of information that seals the deal. And so that to me doesn't feel like an answer to the problem. And when they give that as the answer, it feels a little bit like they're being tone deaf to what the real concerns are. And it does, I think, wrap around this lack of transparency and this sense that you put yourself at risk by engaging in care.
So another question addresses whether or not you're seeing at this point in time, forcing people living with HIV into psychiatric care, psychiatric facilities, as opposed to, or as an alternative to criminalization. I know early on, this was a practice when people had no understanding of sexuality or infectious diseases. So is any of you seeing this as a practice?
Well, I don't know if this is what the person is referring to, but we have seen some instances where, and Newshawn Williams is actually, I think, the primary example where when his sentence was finished, he was forced into civil commitment because they decided he was still a danger to the community. I don't have all the details on this, but my understanding was, there was an unwillingness on his part to sort of agree to their assessment of what kind of behaviors would present a danger, or what he could or couldn't do, and then this ended up with I believe that he is still in civil commitment. So I don't think it's really a psychiatric problem, but it is a way of keeping someone incarcerated that you think that you've decided is a danger.
Thank you. Another participant asked for some concrete examples, if you have them, or measures being taken to assist those living with HIV, particularly in regards to any familiarity with the UN and NGOs that work with the UN. I know there are several, UN, whether they're proclamations or conventions or whatever, that address health issues, and some specifically address those living with HIV. I'm not clear on any specific initiatives particularly towards decriminalization, although there's some policy against it, but I'm not sure of any direct activity from the UN and its NGOs in this regard.
I mean, I know the UN has been active on HIV criminalization. Several years ago, I participated in an assessment, a convening that they did. I want to say this one was in the Bay Area, and they, were assessing HIV criminal laws across different countries. And maybe it was more the entire legal landscape with respect to HIV across the globe. So there's definitely work being done there, and I'm not super familiar with it. I do focus most on the domestic side of things. So if others have anything to add, I don't have anything more there.
Yeah, I don't know more. I mean, there are some other organizations who are focused on this issue internationally and in collecting, examples of enforcement in every country where they can find them. And it's, I think there is as much work left here to do in the U.S. and internationally. That unfortunately, these are not just a domestic thing.
So here's a question that I'll take the liberty of interpreting in a way that I think it could impact what you're observing. Do you ever see any police pressure on facilities or agencies that assist those living with HIV to somehow interfere with their treatment? Any police pressure on disclosure or other information?
I think, and this, I think this is, so I don't know about police pressure, like if you went to a clinic or something and somebody would interfere with your treatment. I think it's important to realize that there's a practice in some states in the United States that when you get your HIV test, you also get a document which you sign. And in that document, you sign that you understand that you're HIV positive, that you understand how the disease can be transmitted, and that there's a criminal law in the state. So you kind of set up a lot of elements of an HIV crime at the moment that you're finding out that you're HIV positive. And I think, and again, I'll just relate this to COVID. There are a number of ways that we that the criminal justice system and law enforcement, if they took a public health perspective, we would be better served. There are also some risks to merging these two systems. It's not. It unfortunately has not been a very productive. I mean, I think the history of HIV criminalization shows you that using the criminal law to fight an epidemic is really not a very efficient way to go about it, and has a lot of negative consequences. I think there's been a lot of efforts to try to get a more public health approach into our criminal justice system, but there's also risks just like that of kind of bringing these two things together. We need people to trust the public health system. And I'm gonna jump back to something Scott mentioned earlier, this repeal versus modernization. And I think this is interesting in kind of the progression of law in Nevada. About 2 years before the state passed its first HIV criminal law, it decided to pull any public health related measures out of its penal code and put it into a new health code, and including a non-HIV specific misdemeanor for disease transmission. And so I think one of these positive steps that we can make is just kind of trying to pull disease, anything dealing with disease transmission out of the penal code, put it in public health, which I think is a safer place for it. And then, with the safeguards Scott was mentioning, so that prosecutions can't help them elsewhere, and there are safeguards in the elements of that public health provision. But we've learned in the last year that public health has a lot of power. And I guess if anyone has to be thinking about penalties that might spread a disease, I'd rather it be the public health folks than the criminal justice folks.
And I believe that North Carolina just did what you're talking about as well, although what they put in their public health code is a fairly sort of cumbersome bit of language that is so tied to science that it is sure to evolve. It'll be interesting to see how long that remains a helpful change.
To answer the original question, we recently actually came in to assist in a criminal defense on behalf of a doctor. This is in Texas, who was being compelled to testify against her patient and in an HIV criminalization prosecution. And so there's that aspect of it in terms of police. I mean, this was not police, but this is, prosecutorial interference in that doctor-patient relationship. And thankfully, this was a doctor who didn't want to do this and felt compelled to, resist this subpoena. It ended up to what Brad was saying earlier in, I think, a more favorable, we were able to sort of shift things enough that the person got a more favorable plea deal, but they still pled to a crime because that's how most of these things are resolved. And that doesn't even, that doesn't feel great either. So.
And I think it's worth noting that regardless of sort of pressure from police or law enforcement, any detention or incarceration is going to interrupt someone's treatment plan and is going to make it harder to access medication that they need and remain compliant. So even without sort of additional layers of law enforcement pressure, we should keep in mind the detrimental effects of incarceration generally.
Oh, I know what else I was going to say. So jumping onto the COVID thing, and I agree with Brad. I'd rather have things in the hands of public health than in the hands of the police. And at the same time, we've seen in several places a push to identify for first responders who in a household has COVID, which is really crazy because COVID infection lasts a relatively short time in most cases. So identifying people, that have had a COVID infection doesn't seem particularly relevant, and it shouldn't be relevant at all in the first place, because every first responder should be treating every person they come across as if they have COVID. So, and yet a bunch of folks in public health thought that this would be a, good and useful information to give to a first responder. So there's this real tendency on both sides of the equation to go off the end of like disclosure and surveillance, and it doesn't always strike a good balance.
Well, it seems that to me that criminalization somehow always jumps to the top when people are looking for remedies, and that's inappropriate with public health issues. But it does seem to have prioritized people's thinking that somehow a criminal statute will change the outcomes.
We've seen this in COVID, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
And our response to it.
Yeah, I was kind of amazed as these stay-at-home, shelter-in-place orders came out. They kind of end with, a misdemeanor or law enforcement. When in most states, the public health departments do have powers. They had powers to, quarantine people, to sanction people. In California, we have a system where you can give somebody a specific order if you feel like they're a public health measure. There's a couple of, higher steps you can take within the public health system, and then transfer it over to the criminal justice system if that doesn't work. And this all pre-existed, but in the obvious kind of rush of trying to respond to COVID, the stay-at-home order in LA, and I think in most places, jumps right to the law enforcement in terms of enforcing this. And there was a need to respond quickly and rapidly to COVID. There's also going to be need for the expansion of public health powers to be cabined in and used appropriately after this is over.
Yeah, I think one of the problems that maybe policymakers had was COVID was so big, and there weren't really the public health personnel to like. How do you get a under-resourced part of the government to address such a widespread thing? And so I think that created another problem of, oh, well, they turn to the police because we've got lots of those, and those are well funded. And so that has to all be like rethought and recalibrated.
It also impacts, while the healthcare for people of color is not as effective or prevalent as for white folks, it also does implicate a lot of white people if you try to take aggressive measures towards enforcement. So I always wonder if there's some bias consideration whenever these laws or policies are enacted.
Well,
yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead.
In this little college town here, we're seeing all of our mask misdemeanor arrests being UA college kids. And it seems like what may be happening is that they are being arrested. Obviously, they're easy targets, so too are a lot of folks, but that they're being arrested knowing that their parents are going to pay for some of these diversionary schemes that are in place, and the city is sort of refunding its coffers and money that has been lost elsewhere due to COVID.
That's really interesting. I mean, we saw certainly other places where the mask mandates were being, and distancing mandates were being enforced in a racially discriminatory way. Again, not a big surprise when you ask a system that already has systemic racism sort of at its core to enforce these laws, that then, that same systemic racism is going to permeate the enforcement of those. So that's not a big surprise. The other thing I was going to say about COVID is there is some thought, and I'd be interested to hear what others think about this. I think in some ways there's a governor on how far people will go in terms of COVID criminalization, because it could affect the very legislator who's actually putting the law in place feels like they could be affected by that type of enforcement. Whereas I think HIV has always felt like I'm dealing with the other. And so I hope.
Yes, and moral implications are not brought into the COVID discussions. Quote moral. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think the discussion this summer around kind of defunding the police or kind of switching resources away from the police to other things. I think this is, and Scott brought up a good point, like kind of how understaffed some of the public health departments are, that this would be a good example that you would want a more robust health department. And part of that, I just noticed one of the comments, somebody, I think feeling that they overheard kind of a public health conversation, an investigator, something came out, and somebody in line at Home Depot. It's in other words, like specific training about how to handle these situations is so important. I know for people with HIV, and I think Courtney and we were talking about contact tracing earlier, it's just when somebody shows up at your house, how they knock on the door, and who ask questions too, says a lot. And then the car pulling up and the way they come in towards the house, and all of that is communicating to people in the house and around the house about what is going on. And so I think having properly trained people whose primary goal protecting health it is really important, and kind of relates to this bigger discussion that Scott brought in about where are we spending resources, and are those places the best places to spend them?
I think you raise a great, go ahead. Great opportunity.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Scott, you go.
I was just going to say, Brad started with sort of a personal story. I'll insert one here, and that is even when it's done well, that surveillance can feel kind of icky. And, so I moved from Chicago to New York, and I popped onto New York's, public health system as a new HIV case. Now, for me, luckily, I've been living with HIV for a while, and, I live with a certain amount of privilege, but, the person leaving notes with the doorman of the or the desk of the building that I was in, that surveillance, it feels like someone's, up in your business. And so I can only imagine in other settings how invasive that would feel, even if it's done with all of the sort of sensitivity that Brad was describing.
Well, and on top of that, going back to our conversation briefly about sex workers, in several states, HIV sex work exposure crimes, you have to register as a sex offender. And so talk about sort of sprawling invasiveness.
Yeah, it's quite horrible.
Well, I'd like to, we just have a few minutes left, but I would like to end with a question from the Q&A that talks about what do you see as next steps in actually ending HIV? We're in a world where we developed a vaccine for COVID rather rapidly, and here we are decades living with HIV.
Yeah, I'll just say I don't think that's for want of trying, right? Very different viruses, and it isn't as if resources have not been put into trying to solve HIV. So in terms of, I'll say that what I said before about, well, we have to address all of the pieces, right? Even if we solve the biomedical side, we would still have all the other components, all the other social determinants of health that are affecting our ability to get a handle on the HIV epidemic. So we really have to address it all. And I think at some point we have to really have universal health care. And, you know, we hopefully we'll take a step closer. But in the end, we just need everybody to have health care.
Brad, what are your
Yeah, I mean, just thinking about where we are with HIV, and I think the experience of COVID, I think I think calls us to have a more bold vision about what we're doing to combat the epidemic, and I think calls us to compassion. And in terms of the vision, I have a personal beef against the HIV treatment cascade or continuum of care, which is how many people are HIV positive, who gets tested, who has a treatment, and who's on medications that makes their viral load undetectable. My vision for my life is not living the rest of my life with an undetectable viral load. I have a vision about quality of life, I have a vision about cure, and I have a vision about vaccine. And unless those things are represented and in that visual and part of the goals of our national and our local strategies, there's going to be less heat around them. And so I think, you know, back when I got infected, it was, you know, you can't cure, no virus has ever been cured. You know, we have vaccines with kind of Hep B, we're developing with COVID, we're getting more sophisticated all the time. We need to renew our energy, like Scott was saying, around people's quality of life, no matter what economic or kind of inequalities they're facing, and renew our energy around for a cure and a vaccine. And this moment calls us, I think, to compassion. And I have, and I think that's difficult because the country's very divided, but I think the way in which we talk about people who don't wear masks or put themselves at risk and then get this disease, which can be very serious, to me conjures up ways I was talked about, or people were talked about with HIV, who didn't always do it right and who took risks. And some of that was too based on ignorance, not having the right information. Some of it based on foolish things people do, young and old. And I think it's a moment to remember that, you know, whatever the mistakes or the ignorance, they're not really justify the consequences for people who get seriously ill with this disease. And we achieve that around HIV to get people to approach the disease and people impacted compassionately. And I think we need to remind ourselves of that as we talk about particularly the next couple of months in this epidemic.
Yeah, thank you. And Courtney, you get the last word.
While I don't deserve it, I will take it nonetheless, because I could not agree more with what Scott is saying about sort of recognizing the three-dimensionality of people living with HIV and also of communities impacted by HIV, and recognizing the extent to which anti-poverty measures are critical to combating HIV and healthcare. And at least here in the South, I think, you know, we've been talking about sort of all of these wonderfully lofty and accurate goals of compassion and empathy, but we need to expand Medicaid. We need to find ways to stop the rapid closure of rural hospitals. The South is the new epicenter of HIV, and we are so medically unequipped to handle that. And I think the COVID analogy obviously does ring true in that sense as well. So to the extent that we can be thinking about concrete ways that we may be able to expand access to health down here, I think that would go a long way towards advancing some of these sort of larger three-dimensional anti-poverty goals that would, you know, best serve folks impacted by HIV generally.
Thank you all. This was a terrific conversation, and I want to thank the participants. We may not have reached all of your questions, but we certainly see them, and particularly to those of you who made suggestions on moving forward, we thank you for that, and those who provided other information. So I want to thank our panelists, and I also want to say that the the ABA HIV Impact Project will be presenting additional webinars. This is part of a series that we started this past fall. So we invite you to look out for that. And there will be a link to this program that you will receive. So we thank the Section on Civil Rights and Social Justice and the Center for Human Rights for supporting us in providing this webinar. And we look forward to seeing and hearing from many of you in our future panels.